Well, good start. So today, it's part 7 of the series of about Christianity Online, and today we'll be talking about how technology interacts with the deadly sin of lust. So we previously spoke about how technology is changing us, but how technology is neither good nor bad. But it does present challenges for us with the way we interact online and how we live our Christian lives. And today we'll be speaking about lust and the antidote to lust, which is abstinence or celibacy. And the framework we're using is the 7 deadly sins. And these are the 7 vices which are thought to drive or be at the root of all our sort of negative decision-making or poor decision-making. But because what these 7 deadly sins do, and in the case of lust as well, is they give you this cheap momentary pleasure. And that cheap momentary pleasure means you make these same bad decisions over and over again. But over time, they lack any virtue. A good place to start is, what do we think lust is? So we know phrases like bloodlust, wanderlust, and I suppose the biggest issue is that a lot of people don't know how to distinguish between love and lust, which we'll talk about in a second. If we look to the definition of lust, it's basically primarily associated with the notion of a strong sexual desire. But it can also be used in a more general sense to describe an intense passion or desire for something. You know, at the moment I have a lust for sleep. But when you think about those definitions, then they're not really negative. Okay, to have an intense desire or passion is not a negative thing necessarily. But when we speak of it in a religious sense, that intense sexual desire may be referred to as illicit or sinful. And again, it's not just about the act itself. And I've got a quote at the top there from St. Gregory. It says, "Anger is a perversion of courage, as lust is a perversion of love." And so a lot of things, a lot of times the world will talk about love, but what they're really describing is lust. And there's several different aspects to lust, just as we spoke about with things like gluttony. You think about what we idolize, how we treat our bodies, health concerns, how we give into temptation or desires of the flesh, and how we lack self-control or restraint. And the 7 deadly sins basically, you focus on what it gives you, but you forget that contentment comes through God and God alone. So one of the big questions is, are you falling in love or are you falling in lust? And we'll look at some of the differences in a second. So we know how the Bible describes love in 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. It says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud, it does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." And what I won't be addressing today is the sort of more general notion of the imagery and messages we're bombarded with on social media and the internet. You think of the LGBTQI issues, Transgender Pride Month. It's all about celebrating your sexual orientation and desires and how you go about fulfilling them, despite the negative consequences that flow from that. You think about modern feminism, they speak about the disparities, but one of the things is they encourage women to take hold of their sexuality and basically promote promiscuity. And these are sort of issues that clearly fall in the lust column because it's focused on a physical connection. It's about satisfying your own desires. It's short, intense, and that sensation fades quickly. It's based on superficial qualities, like how someone looks, what their status is, what they have or own. And it's passionate and volatile, like a roller coaster ride. And if you think about those qualities, that they are the exact opposite of what love is, as we've just described from Corinthians. So how does that reflect in our daily lives and what people do? So many single people have turned to technology in their dating lifestyle, that they use apps on their phone. And just in the interactions I've had with females at work or in my life, I know that a lot of them complain that there are no eligible single bachelors in all of South Australia. Yet they date multiple men at the same time. And they have no hesitation in swiping left, which is to say, I'm not interested in this guy. And they take 2 seconds to consider it. And I remember sitting there at one break and someone's just swiping left. I was like, well, what was wrong with that guy? He was wearing a purple shirt. I can't be in a relationship with someone who wears a purple shirt. And so, rather than looking to invest time in getting to know people, it's more expedient in the short term to find excuses to not get to know people. You wait around for Mr. Perfect. And it's symptomatic of what technology offers us and what we want. We want perfection and we want it now. And you don't settle for anything less. The clip here is of this girl. I don't know if the video is going to play, but I won't play it. But basically, this guy goes around and he asks women what they want. And women say, yes, he has to be at least 6 feet tall. He can't be obese. And this particular girl said he must earn at least $200,000 a year. And, and the guy said, well, what percentage of the population do you think that is? She said, oh, maybe 2%. And she said, no, that's actually 0.045%. Not even 0.5%, 5% of a percent is her dating profile. But she won't change her ideals. That's what she's got. So, yeah, many aren't willing to settle. And you think about the impact on the other side. There's lots of perfectly average guys who tend to get swiped left. But more people are the purple shirt guy, right? There's lots of purple shirt guys. And they have difficulty entering into relationships. And there's lots of social experiments. So this guy pictured here, the reason I chose him is he's probably one of the more average looking guys with an average profile. And he swiped right. He said yes to 16,000 women. And his results were as follows. He got 290 matches. He got 99 messages. He had 68 conversations. 40 people ended up ghosting him, which means they just never ended up speaking back. He got 11 phone numbers. He went on 3 dates in total, and that was it. And that's the impact of commoditizing relationships. It's just another thing you can get off the shelf. It's sort of like the approach we have to it now. I know a few of us here, watch Dr. Jordan Peterson, and he often speaks about a crisis in masculinity. And men are a bit uncertain in the current climate as to how to date and how to go about relationship issues. And what you're finding is a lot of guys only know how to approach a woman from behind a computer screen, especially the younger generations, because on any given date, you could be confronted of being accused of any sort of toxic masculinity, mansplaining, objectifying women, gender stereotypes, things like that. But oftentimes, if you hold traditional Christian values, if you think a woman should be the primary caregiver, if you think if someone breaks into your home, the man's going to jump out and be the one to protect the family, those are traditional values, but that could be taken to be toxic masculinity. And those of us who did go to see Dr. Peterson speak, I remember you could, on Slido, you could upload a question for him to consider. And lots of those questions were about Andrew Tate. And it was quite clear that a lot of the young men in the audience saw him as somewhat of a role model. And just for you who don't know Andrew Tate, he's a Muslim and an accused sex trafficker. All right, so the consequences. So the consequence is that, that there's fewer and fewer people, or it's becoming more and more difficult to enter into long-term relationships, because your entire value as a person is reduced to a selfie and one paragraph. And from that one paragraph and one selfie, you've got to distinguish yourself from everyone else in society. You've got to communicate all of your meaningful characteristics, how intelligent you are, how humorous you are, how generous you are, how much charisma you have. And if you're lucky, you might have one or two dates to prove all those characteristics before someone gives up and says, well, there's plenty more fish in the sea. You're not Mr. Perfect. And it's becoming more and more mainstream, this approach. So many people have these apps who are single, but it's making people more and more socially inept. So how do people cope? One reaction has been the rise in the use of adult content online, and a rise in shorter term non-committal relationships. And according to the American, the APA, the American Psychology Association, the accessibility, affordability, and anonymity of the internet means that almost everyone has access to adult content on their devices. And interestingly enough, even though we know everyone's got access to it, when you ask people, do you think that's having a negative impact? In one big study back in 2002, so the stats would have got worse since then, but 72% said it was harmless. 86% said it could be educational. And 80% felt fine with their use of it. And only 9% said they felt like they were addicted or unable to stop looking at it. So, and since then, they found that multiple studies have also found that when you increase more and more, consume more and more of this content, it leads to lower self-esteem, poorer relationships, and lower satisfaction and intimacy. And from the male side in particular, increased use of adult content results in emotional withdrawal from the relationship. And men report increased secrecy, less intimacy, and more signs of depression. And so most of the leading edge research in this area in terms of online addiction is performed by a lady called Valerie Boone, who's an MD and PhD neuropsychiatrist at the University of Cambridge. And she's mapping the brain function of how it impacts on people. And she's basically found that when you consume lots and lots of adult content, it is basically as addictive as some pretty hardcore drugs. And you can see that through the mapping of the brains. And there is a clear difference between healthy patients and patients who have a compulsive sexual behavior. And two of those key findings are that younger test subjects, so the younger you are, the more likely you are to get a big dopamine spike, the feel-good reaction from viewing this online content. And what it means is that they're also more susceptible to becoming addicted, and they're also more susceptible to be conditioned by what they see. You know, monkey see, monkey do. So the younger you are, the higher the chance you will become addicted, and the higher the chance that you'll be conditioned to what you see. And yeah, it's also clear that the myth that if you've got a higher libido, that drives that sort of addiction, that's basically more or less been proven to be false through these studies. Yeah, but because what they find is, like a drug addict, the more you're addicted, the more you need to consume. And the word need there, okay, they feel the need to consume it. And what happens is you go from very soft images to some very hardcore sort of images in eroticism. And you know that through some of the biggest websites in the world and the search terms that people are using. So that's of great concern. And again, there with adolescents in particular, there was a study back in 2012. I think that's been updated now. And what it highlights is adolescents who view a lot of this content are constantly distracted by thoughts, sexual thoughts. They've got more permissive attitudes towards intimacy. They engage in risky behavior and harassment. That they have body and performance insecurities, and they have clinical signs of depression. And I'll point out again that that's just from adolescents. So the world's top 50 websites, you might be surprised that of the top 50, 4 of those relate to adult content, and two of them are inside the top 10. 1 in every 4 internet searches is for adult content. So think about that. Every 4th search term in Google or whatever search engine is for adult content. At any given second, like right now, this second, almost 29,000 people are watching adult-related content. And the amount spent on websites is basically the same amount that the US government spends on foreign aid each year. And this data is a bit old, so that those numbers would have only increased since then. So we look at addiction, the slide on the left, 87% of college-age males consume adult content. 50% of them watch it weekly, and 20% of them watch it daily. And the slide on the right, you can see just in the top bar there, it's a bit small, but it says adult sites comprise 12% of the internet. 90% of children aged 8 to 16 have seen adult content, 8 to 16 years old. The largest consumers of adult content, 12 to 17-year-old boys. 70% of men aged 18 to 34 visit one of these sites every month. Okay, and the slides here just show that it's a problem in the church as well. So that 72% shows frequent use by 13 to 24-year-olds who aren't Christian. The 41% shows frequent use by Christians in the same age group. And the stat on the right just shows how prevalent of an issue it is, even amongst the church, male Christians. But nobody's really talking about it. So things to think about. This generation's got access to the most explicit content ever in the history of the world. And it's available at the click of a button. And more importantly, this is what our youth is watching. It's what is teaching them about relationships, about intimacy. They're not learning it in sex ed at school. It's not coming from the parents or anything else. It's coming from the internet. And we just learned that is shaping how people think about it. And society largely accepts that this sort of adult content. And in one recent survey of Gen Zs and millennials, 56% thought it more immoral to not recycle than to watch adult content. Okay, not recycling is worse than watching this content. Okay, according to the youth. But you've got to think, what lies behind the rampant use of all of this? Generally, when you have an addiction, it fills a void or a hole. Normally there's broken relationships behind an addiction. Okay, broken relationships with other people, broken relationships with God. And what it does is when you fall into this trap, you end up objectifying women and viewing them as objects for your pleasure. And the biggest myth of all, and this is one I think most people would tell themselves, it is the line, I'm not hurting anyone. Okay, I'm in my own home, doing my own thing, minding my own business. You know, what harm's it doing? Well, you know, we've had Danny up here recently speaking about, you know, the adult industry. Your demand drives the supply, and the supply is huge because the demand is huge. Facilitates prostitution, sex trafficking, lots of evils in the world because of the demand for it. So you think about how people have responded. Short-term rentals, I call it. People don't want long-term relationships. So a survey by Pew Research of 5,000 people, that's a meaningful study. 50% of singles are not interested in dating or a committed relationship. Only 10% wanted casual, non-committal relationships. 26% were open to whatever comes their way. And only 14% were looking for a long-lasting relationship. And on the right, you think, well, why are singles not looking for long-term relationships? In the big two, I have more important things to do, right? 47%. And I like being single, 44%. Okay. So, and what's replacing those longer-term relationships? People still have their physical urges and impulses. And if you're not in a long-term relationship, you're finding other avenues to fulfill those urges. Okay, which is where the online content, you know, shorter-term relationships, shall we call them, are becoming more and more prevalent. So I pulled some stats from the ABS, from the recent census, and what it reveals is the falling rate of marriage, the increasing ratio of marriages ending in divorce, and the rising prevalence of de facto relationships, and the increase in fractured family units or broken families. So here, from 2001 to 2021, you can see that the total number of registered marriages has fallen from 103,000 in 2001 to 89,000 in 2021. 2020 was the low, but that was heavily COVID impacted as well. The crude marriage rate basically means how many people on average are getting married, and that's dropped from 5.3, 3.5. And the bottom two rows, you can see in 2001, 46.9% were married by a minister of religion. So take that to be sort of like a church wedding for church people. In 2021, that fell to 19.3% of weddings. You look at the divorce indicators. So from 2001 to 2021, it's remained pretty steady at 55, 56,000. So the rate of marriage is falling, the rate of divorce is stable. So the number of marriages ending in divorce is increasing. And you look at the middle lines there, median duration of marriage. Most marriages end in separation after 8 years, and between 11 and 12 years, that's when divorce happens. And the number of divorces impacting on children is basically constant at 50%, and there's normally 2 kids involved. So that's 2 kids ending up with broken families out of most divorces. Relationship history by age. So what's that's saying? Registered marriages only. So you can see the bottom row, it's 87% for people aged 75 and over. They've only ever been in a marriage. When you work your way down, you can see that ratio falling and falling and falling. till you get to the, the newer breed, where it's 40% or 4%, okay, for the really young people. And as you see the marriage ratio fall, what do you see corresponding? You see the de facto relationship increase. 75 and over, 0%. 25, 18 to 34, shall we say, in the 30%. People don't want that commitment. And, if you hear Jordan Peterson speak about de facto and living together before marriage, he basically describes it as, well, if it doesn't work out, I can just nick off and find something better, but because you're not committed to it. And you can see the percentage that have never been married is also on the rise as we go through the generations. Family structure by age of youngest child. What this basically is saying is, if you look to the bottom row, 15 to 17, only 60% of family units remain intact. So 6 out of 10 marriages, which result in children, remain intact by the time that child is 17. 29% of relationships for a 17-year-old child will mean they'll have a one-parent family. Okay, and 8% of 17-year-olds will be in a step family by the time they're 17. Okay, so that just goes to show the nature and extent of broken families, single parent families. Okay. And this slide just goes to show that 20 to 30% of people with one parent, children who have one parent living elsewhere, only 20 to 30%. But they may not get visited at all. So what's wrong with the status quo? What's wrong with it is God created Eve because it was not good for man to be alone. He created the man and woman, and God's plan is for male and female to leave their parents, become one flesh, and to raise children in that family unit, which is clearly not what we were just talking about. That's the role of gender, marriage, and sex, spelt out at creation for all time and all people. And just think about what if everyone lived according to biblical values? There'd be no STDs, no sex trafficking, no prostitution, no rape, no sexual abuse, no divorce, no broken families, no abortion. The world would objectively be a better place. And we know it is important because God's love for us is through the illustration of marriage. God's bride is the church. Now, just to put it on a personal level, God has wired the laws of attraction into us. Okay? Otherwise, we just partner up with some random person. What specifically attracted you to your partner? But what happens if that feeling goes away? That's how divorces happen, how broken families happen. What if that wasn't really love? Maybe I was deceived or tricked into it. I deserve to have that feeling all the time. And it can't be wrong if it feels so good. But we know that love is a commitment. And even when that feeling vanishes, you have to love someone through thick and thin. And making that commitment brings deeper contentment, richness, and fulfillment. And when you get married as a covenant before God, you're basically saying, I want your best for the rest of your life. So what we're basically saying here is that why is sex outside of marriage wrong? And basically, the main reason is you're lying to yourself. We communicate our bodies. If I raise my middle finger, that means something. If I give you a thumbs up, that means something. If I give you a hug, that means something. So what does intercourse communicate? It's intimacy, it's trust, and it's about permanence because of the risk of having the implications of having a child, okay? And when the physical act doesn't match what you're trying to communicate, you're only lying to yourself, and what we do with our body counts. And with the online content, it's not a question of if our youth is going to be exposed. It's a matter of when and to what degree. And what you'll find is that the need for biblical truth is greater than ever before. And so what you need to prevent is that the focus on ourselves, okay? People just view the act itself as a physical pleasure, cheap thrills, no responsibility, no restraint. However, that only leads to destructive pathways because God is restrictive. We are wired for intimacy and meaningful relationships, and that's why God instituted marriage. Lots of people in the world are looking for intimacy in all the wrong places. And really, it's sort of like they want to be loved and cared for. But that's what God provides us. So what does the Bible have to say? And yeah, Proverbs 6, do not lust in your heart after a beauty or let her captivate you with her eyes. Proverbs 7, 10 to 27 is a long passage, but I'd encourage you to read it. But because it describes how people are led astray through their lust and desires. And perhaps a quote lots of people are familiar with is Matthew 5, 27 to 29. You shall not commit adultery, but I'll tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, in researching this, the best stories you can find, you think about Israel's greatest, Samson. When you first got introduced to Samson in the Bible, he basically looks at a woman not from his own people and says, I want her. Mum and Dad, that's my wife, go get her for me. And then you find later that that person who he wants for his wife basically tries to manipulate him because she's threatened by his guest at the bridegroom's party. So he's tricked into telling her the secret. You think, well, that relationship's off to a great start. And then you find Samson's a very impulsive guy. Like, so when he lost the bet, he had to get 30 garments. So he basically went up and beat down 30 Philistines, took their clothes and gave them to the people to pay his debt. And then there's a whole tit for tat sort of a series of things there. And he burns down the Philistines' fields. And they burn his former fiancée and her father to death. And eventually the Samson takes the jawbone of a donkey and he slays 1,000 Philistines. So he's a very impulsive sort of guy. And after that, we hear Samson's visiting a prostitute. Okay, and people know that and they try to ambush him and kill him. And then, most famously of all, we hear Samson falls in love with Delilah. And the Philistine leaders approach her and say, if you can tell us the secret to his strength, we'll reward you with lots of silver. Just tell us how we can subdue him and overpower him. And Delilah tries to charm Samson into telling her his secret on many separate occasions. First, she just asks him. And then, after she doesn't get what she wants, she tries to guilt Samson into divulging his secret by saying, oh, you lied and you made a fool out of me. And then she tries the line, if you love me, you should confide in me. Okay? And Samson finally capitulates and tells her the secret. And it's quite interesting. In Judges 16:16, it basically says he was nagged into it. He was getting sick of the nagging. Okay? So great example of a relationship there. And once he divulged that secret, we know what happened. He was captured by the Philistines. He was blinded. And God grants him his strength one last time, in which he tears down the temple and kills about 3,000 Philistines with him. You think about Samson's tragic life. And then, yeah, so he was tricked into lust on more than one occasion. It cost him his life. By staying in a relationship with a manipulative, seductive woman whose only goal was to betray him. But again, he was subject to his impulses. We think about David, said to be a man after God's own heart, willing to do everything God wanted him to do. David was God's greatest and most courageous warrior, slayed Goliath, won many battles, united the kingdom of Israel. However, the great King David succumbed to his lust which resulted in the death of innocent people. Because David, obviously, we know, gazed upon Bathsheba when she was bathing. And he sent a messenger down and he found out she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So what does David do? He sends Uriah to the front lines of the war and then has his troops leave him there by himself, basically, so he's going to die. And what does he do when he realizes that Uriah's dead? He says, oh, great, now I can marry Bathsheba. And they conceived a son, and that God obviously didn't like that. The prophet Nathan rebuked him, but he was still punished by God in several different ways. The child he fathered with Bathsheba died. Adversity and rebellion was to come from his own household. His son Absalom tried to take the throne from him. And his own wives were to be given to those close to him in broad daylight before all of Israel, which is what Absalom did when he pitched a tent on the roof and slept with his father's concubines. And then we think of Solomon, wise King Solomon, who was the child of David and Bathsheba, and he became the king of Israel. And he was God's wisest and most prosperous leader, and Israel flourished under his reign. However, despite his wisdom, Solomon's devotion to God was eventually wonder as a result of succumbing to his lustful desires. So Solomon had 700 wives and 200 concubines. And despite warnings that having these foreign wives would lead people astray, and despite his great wisdom, he still held fast to his own lustful desires. And what it means was, in the Bible, it says he was no longer fully devoted to God. His wives had turned his heart away from God. And you think of the consequences there. He married these wives and concubines who did not follow God. So they didn't teach their children to follow God. And so the grandchildren became pagans. And what happened was basically the whole of the empire collapsed. It was divided, then it was conquered. And if you trace it all back, it's all through lust. So you think of the consequences of succumbing to lust. What did Samson lose? What did David lose? What did Solomon lose? What was it really worth it? And when you think of who you are in comparison, what has lust brought down? Lust brought down the wisest man, Solomon. Lust brought down the strongest man, Samson. And lust brought down the bravest man, David. And if it can bring those people down, it can certainly bring the most manly of men down today as well. And I'll just rush through these last few slides, but lust begins with the eyes and what we see. Okay, and so instead of just laying out the problem, you think, what do we do about it? And so there's the Billy Graham rule, and Mike Pence is a big advocate of it. And I know William has spoken of it too, but that is, you try not to spend too much time by yourself alone with other women. Okay, and why is that? Because it's a display of integrity, a way to avoid temptation and any appearance of sexual misconduct. But it's not just about what you do with your body. Just abstaining from the act itself is not enough. What if you're really, really ugly? What if you can't leave the house? Well, okay, well, I'm not doing anything. That doesn't make you pure. Okay, it's about mind, body, and soul. Just quickly, AC Green, Lakers champion, Showtime. So, but these guys were just big celebrities across America. So his teammates were like Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Later in his life, Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant. He won 3 championships, but he was a devout Christian, and he vowed to remain a virgin until marriage. And fans used to taunt him. They used to wave placards of bikini-clad girls when he was trying to shoot free throws. And his teammates would send women to his hotel room. They would ask him out to all these parties, with all the beautiful people and A-list celebrities. And throughout it all, his 15 years in the NBA, women throwing himself at him, he managed to remain a virgin the whole time. And they said, well, how did you resist all that? And he said, well, I won't go out with you guys, but I'll pray for you guys. And when they sent women to his room, what did he do? He said he just prayed super loudly until it became so awkward that the women left. So that's and yeah, he did eventually get married after he retired. And he said, when you marry the right person at the right time, you have no regrets. For me, I have nothing but smiles on my face. And now he runs a foundation which celebrates remaining abstinent until marriage. So when Romans and Galatians, Paul talks about putting on Jesus, okay? Behaving decently, clothe yourselves with Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify desires of the flesh. And most importantly, we know that our bodies are not our own. We were bought for a price. Okay, God died for us. He bought us at that price. And in Corinthians, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is in us. Okay? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And, that's the thing, like if the Holy Spirit is within us, do we exchange that for the cheap thrill of a mere momentary pleasure, physical pleasure? And in 1 Peter and Romans, it's just basically saying sexual immorality is not God's will for us. And just quickly there, we think about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Living for the flesh is easy, but living for God isn't easy. So we need to keep that in mind. And so how do we resist the temptation? Okay, so if you've got a problem, write it down and what you need to do to confront it. Why do you want to stop? Because it's going to impact on your future relationships. It might impact on your current family. Remove access to sites or circumstances in which you may be tempted. Okay, you can put internet filters on. Covenant Eyes is one of those. The Billy Graham rule, the Mike Pence rule. When tempted, think of a healthy substitute. AC Green prays out loud. Okay, when I'm feeling lazy at work, I put on a hymn. And it tends to boost my motivation and productivity. But be aware of your triggers and try to interrupt that thought process. So when you're on the verge of temptation, all you have to do is distract yourself for 10 seconds. Get up, get a drink, do something, and the chances are you mitigate that immediate impulse to do something. And just finally there, Romans 8:5-9 to 13, 8:5 to 13. It's about you either live in the spirit or you live in the flesh. And it's made quite clear these things are mutually exclusive. You can't have both. You can't live in the flesh and say that you're living in the spirit. And thanks for your patience. And I'll hand the time back to John. Thank you.